Perfect. So thank you everybody for coming to the event this evening, and a special thank you to our two guests who have come at a very late hour to be in the event. Sorry, there you go. So on this evening's event, we're going to be doing a Q&A event. So I'll just give everyone a bit of background on Mongolia and then a bit of a background on our two guests, and then we'll get into our questions. So Mongolia is a country based in Asia. It is one of the 18th largest country in the world in terms of land area, and it has a population of over 3 million people. In 2002, being a member of the Sogyes community became legal in Mongolia, but even today in 2021, same-sex marriage is still not recognised. I won't go into too much more detail, as the questions that we have later on in the event will bring in a lot of detail about the country. So about Jack, one of our guests on. So Jack is a queer rights activist from Mongolia and currently studying in Melbourne for his master's degree in public health. He has worked with the LGBT Centre in Mongolia for 5 years in charge of the health programme, and has been instrumental in identifying healthcare system gaps and developing opportunities to improve access to healthcare for queer Mongolians. He has been currently working on his research project focusing on the lived experience of young queer Mongolians as part of his master's degree. Jack identifies as cisgender gay male. His pronouns are he/him. So thank you so much for being here, Jack. And then our other guest, Inkma. So Inkma is the executive director of the first and only non-governmental organisation working to secure, promote and safeguard the civil, political, economical, cultural and social rights of the LGBTQI plus people in Mongolia. Inkma identifies as genderqueer, queer person of colour from the global south, as an intersectional feminist, a human rights defender of the LGBTQI rights activist. She gained her BA in Women's and Gender Studies at San Francisco State University in California in the US, and her pronouns are she/they. So we'll get on started into the questions of the evening. If the guests would like to just unmute their microphones when they're ready to answer, that would be great. So our first question, obviously I've given a little bit of background about both of you, but can you tell us a bit about yourself, your organisation and the work that you do?
Okay. Hi everyone, thank you for being here. And thank you for the introduction, Lauren. So well, not much about me. I am 30 plus years old. I'm engaged to my partner. Yeah, that's pretty much it. I work a lot. So about the center has 3 core programs, legal, health, and youth. And we were established in 2007. And we are the sole organizer of the Equality and Pride Days. It is our 9th year this year. Our Pride Days take place end of August through beginning of September. I guess I can just share currently what we're doing. Currently under our legal program, we are working on to train 90 prosecutors on hate crime, partnering with the General Prosecutor's Office. And we are planning the Equality and Pride Days of 2021. Due to COVID-19, we are struggling with many of our events. And hopefully in the process, I could say more about the center.
Perfect, thank you so much for that. And Jack?
Hi everyone. Thanks so much for organizing this event. I'm more than happy to be a part of this event tonight. And you introduced me very briefly and accurately. So I used to work at the LGBT Center in charge of health program for 5 years before I start my master's degree in Australia. Now I'm living in Australia for 2 years. I'm this close to finish my everything, and I'm packing right now. I'm going back home. So I was expected to land in Mongolia in the beginning of August. So August 1st is the first day I'm going to be in Mongolia. And what else? And yeah, like the LGBT Center was the first and only organization that focuses on LGBTI human rights in Mongolia, and more than happy to be stating that I was part of that. And like Ingmar said, we have three main programs. I was managing the health program, and the health program like mostly focuses on everything except HIV. So I could say that like we mainly focus on three like different areas: mental health, transition-related healthcare, and lesbian, bisexual, sexual and reproductive health. So like LGBT Center like mainly focuses on those like left behind health issues. Since like HIV and like sexual health for men was like, you know, like mainly focused on by different organizations. So we were doing what's left behind. So that was my role at the center.
Perfect. Thank you so much for this information. So moving on to our second question, what is the history of LGBT people in Mongolia, both legally, socially, and culturally? If you just, whoever wants to go first.
History. So let me just try to explain cultural and social like attitude and history about like LGBT people, and Inkma can talk about like legal like part more after that. So like I mentioned, and you also mentioned that I was doing my small research project focusing on young LGBTQ people in Mongolia as part of my master of public health degree. So like I learned, I know, like I just wrote a paper about like a little bit of history and stuff. So it's fresh now, so I could just talk a little bit about history. So like homosexuality and like gender diversity was part of a society for a long time in Mongolia, according to that, like some of the oral and written history. And homosexuality was like very much commonly like practiced behavior in Mongolia up until socialist regime took place in 1920, and like homosexuality was mainly practiced among clergies, between the lamas, and this Buddhism has like a lot of the homosexual like aspects in it, and transgender and gender diversity was also very much like commonly practiced and normalized in Mongolian society up until 17th century due to this shamanistic culture. Traditionally, Mongolia has this big shamanistic cultures, and shamanism was like mainly practiced like shamanism was a big practice up until 17th century in Mongolia. So in the shamanist culture, like gender diversity was a very common thing. And like male, like LGBT people, like intersex people, gender diverse people were chosen as a vessel in shamanistic culture most of the time. They were practicing this gender diversity in their daily lives, and male shamans lived as a female, and like they were like in a relationship with same-sex people during the time. So according to some of the written history of anthropology. And another thing is that Mongolia was a nomadic society, therefore there is not much written, unfortunately. So up until recently, like we didn't even have a word to describe those like gender and sexual diversity. So like we because of our culture and everything, we don't have that much written history, but like we have oral history and stuff, and also we have some like very little is written in Western history, like Western like literature, and that's pretty much it. And 1920, the beginning of like 1920, socialist regime took place. So Mongolia is the second socialist country right after Russia. So Soviet propaganda like took place in Mongolia for 7 long decades, since 1920 to 1990, and we became democratic in 1990. And during the socialist regime, homosexuality was mainly like condemned by the state officially, and homosexuals like fall into a category of mental illness, and also like criminalized as well. But like later on, it's expelled, and like during the socialist area, like homosexuality, like men who have like sexuality as a desire, everything outside of this marriage and like socialist idea was like considered as sexual problem, and people who's practicing outside of the socialist idea of sexuality was uh, portrayed as people who's against the state. Anyway, and the democracy since 1990 opened a big space for Mongolia, a big space for social movement to rise. And since 1990, Mongolia explored, and Mongolia started the civil rights movement in terms of many different identity politics, many different human rights field. And unfortunately, like people's view, public view on sexuality and gender diversity remain unchanged. This socialist like propaganda, socialist regime already shaped very strongly like the public views on sexuality and gender diversity is very like much shaped by this socialist idea. So even the transition was a big thing, even though like it was like many like things have been changed during the transition from socialism to democracy. Like LGBT issue is like remain unchanged, unfortunately. So now like because of that, modern Mongolia is still facing a lot of challenges in terms of gender and sexual diversity. I hope like it was clear. I just been nervous, and I just tried to remember everything that I was writing. And
no, that was so interesting.
A bit about it.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
Life.
I just have a follow-up question for what you were just saying there. So do you think not having a written history of sort of LGBTQI in Mongolia has made a difference in your culture? You're just on mute.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like not having enough history, not having enough evidence actually makes our like job harder. Like in LGBT activism, the passion, you know, like street fight and everything's important, but at the same time, for like people like me, for an activist, the evidence, the facts are really important. We need like information, evidence, history, facts to like back up our like advocacy and activism. Unfortunately, it's not the case most of the time in Mongolia. It makes our like activism even harder. People just think that in modern Mongolia, people think homosexuality, especially homosexuality, as well as gender diversity, is something that imported from Western culture, especially from America, and like those like European culture just brought like we brought that kind of like sexual and gender diversity from those countries. That is very common misconception that is strongly existing among Mongolian society right now, and it is making like things even harder that we don't have any evidence in written history that actually can like, you know, fight against this kind of like strong misconceptions.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that. Just to move on with Inkma. So Inkma, do you want to talk a bit more about the legal side, as Jack said?
Yes, I'll do that. But I also want to add a few things to Jack's answer. So documenting our history is is such an important thing. And at the center, that's what we are focusing on. For example, during Equality and Pride Days, we organize Beyond the Blue Sky Film Festival. And in several years ago, we used to translate foreign queer films, and screen them in Mongolia. But in the past 2 years, and this is our third year, we are focusing on uh, creating queer Mongolian films. So it's to, the Mongolian queer people needs to tell their story from their perspective in their context. So we encourage filmmakers, artists. We encourage people who write books. So anything that we can archive our movement, we try. And we also do a theater, like queer community theater. It's all based on volunteers, approximately about 50 volunteers involved each year. This year we are planning on doing 3 plays. It's all written, directed, and played by queer volunteers. So, and then we document them as well. Just wanted to emphasize on the, even though we don't have a written history, we are trying to archive everything we're doing. So moving on to the legal part of queer people in Mongolia, like Jack said, uh, with the fall of Soviet Union, we abolished the totalitarian regime in 1990 and adopted our first democratic constitution in 1992. So on the legal part, I want to focus on 3 significant legislations: the Constitution, gender marker law, and criminal code. So the Constitution it provides an international treaties to which Mongolia is a party shall become effective as domestic legislation. And this is very good for us. So Mongolia is ratified to 8 out of 9 core UN treaty bodies. And the LGBT Center utilizes the UN human rights mechanism since our establishment. And in the past decade, we have submitted over 10 shadow reports to the UN treaty bodies and charter-based mechanisms, and obtained approximately more than 60 recommendations. And most recently, in 2021, the third UPR cycle, Universal Periodic Review, which takes place every 4.5 years. I'm not sure if you are aware, if you know this. So this year we were very successful. We obtained 15 LGBTQI specific recommendations, and one of those recommendations was especially significant because it was a trans-specific recommendation. So we do, in Mongolia, we have a gender marker law since 2009, and unfortunately, this law was ratified in 2018, and it kind of added a new requirement for gender marker, which was a medical intervention. However, we do not, in our healthcare sector, we do not have trans-specific or intersex-specific healthcare. So no one was able to access this gender marker law since it was revised in 2018. So Israeli was the one who recommended this trans-specific recommendation, which was to remove this medical intervention from the gender marker law. Thankfully, the government of Mongolia supported this recommendation, meaning they are committed to implementing it in the next 4.5 years. So this is a great success for us. Another thing is in 2015, our criminal law was revised, and for the first time, the terminology, sexual orientation and gender identity entered the Mongolian legislation. So within the criminal code, there is an anti-discrimination clause. So it now has a prohibition based on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. This is, again, a very amazing success for us. And this law was enforced on July 2017. However, the implementation is just simply not there. Until this year, no case was tried in any level of court. So in the past 2 years, the center has been supporting a case. And after 2 years, finally, we pushed one case through all 3 levels of this case. However, this was very expensive. This involved so many people. So an ordinary people are unable to access this law. So on paper, Mongolia looks very good, especially within our regime. Even recently, Mongolia just in April 2021 adopted a human rights defenders law. This is the first in the regime. However, again, the implementation is quite simply not there. So the center works hard to demand implementation. Like I said earlier, like training 90 prosecutors is one of our, efforts to improve the implementation, I guess. Yeah, but it's not our job. We are the only queer human rights organization in Mongolia. We only have 4 people working, and it's a load of work for us. And yeah, that's the situation. And the bureaucracy within the government is really tough, and it's very hard to work with the government. Yeah, and then the government is supposed to, any new law, they need to bring public awareness, they need to train, inform, however, they simply don't do that. Yeah, that's pretty much it in terms of.
That was so interesting. Thank you so much. Sorry, I was just sat taking in like all of the information that you were like saying. I feel like it's super interesting that obviously, as you said, you're going out of your way in an artistic form to kind of make these archives where there isn't a history. And I think that that's obviously amazing to do it in such an artistic way rather than just the traditional writing it down in books. But yeah, thank you so much for such a detailed answer, both of you. So moving on to our next question, what are the issues faced by the LGBT community in Mongolia currently?
Excuse me, can you just repeat the question? I think I was on the moon while you was.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely fine. Of course I can. So what are the issues faced today by the LGBT community in Mongolia?
Of course, there are a lot of issues. And like Inkma said, Mongolia is really good when it comes to like law and when it comes to paper. Like Mongolia, like if you just take a look at this like LGBT rights like map, the world map, Mongolia is really progressive. And we like since this new like criminal code law adoption, we became one of the first Asian countries that actually protected like that actually included sexual orientation, gender identity as a protected ground in the criminal code. So we are very successful, very progressive on the paper, but in the reality, it's simply not there. The implementation is not there. People are not able to access the law. It's like, what the like point of like having and adopting law if that law is not applying to the citizens, if that law is not protecting LGBT people. But that's like, again, that's a progress. And with the law, we can just push the implementation. Obviously, it's a like really important thing, but like implementation, the reality and the progress on the paper is like really different. There's a significant gap between these two. That's what I'm trying to say. And also, again, the society is very like patriarchal and hypermasculine and heteronormative society, and simply like majority of Mongolian society ignores LGBT people and simply deny the existence of queer people in Mongolia. So that's still the fact. Even after the law, that still continues, and young people, like in my study, like in my research, young people are like expressing all of those issues, especially these public misconceptions around homosexuality and gender diversity. Is a big thing that fueled the fire of hatred and discrimination towards queer people. And for many years, like especially homosexuality considered as mental illness, it's still believed. So many people still think that homosexuality can be treated, homosexuality can be changed if the person feeling to change themselves. And media, Mongolian media, and the art and media industry is not a very big fan of queer issues as well. LGBT people have never been portrayed positively in media so far. And what else? And we don't have any out celebrities that like young people can reference. And it is really, actually in reality, it is dangerous society for people to be like living as a out queer like person. That is why there are not so many out people. And like according to like United Nations report, almost like more than 90% of the like people still remain closeted due to fear of harassment, fear of, like violence that is coming to them if they like open up about the sexual and gender diversity. And what else? Like trans issue and intersex issue is simply like invisible in Mongolia. Now, thanks to some of the public figures, like we have some like trans like women in fashion and makeup industry that has been successful. And thanks to them, like public awareness is increasing on certain part of like these issues. For example, now Mongolian public is aware of like existence of trans women. On the other hand, like trans men is completely invisible, and like for a majority there is no such thing trans man, for example. And like health care is one of the like left behind sector in Mongolia in terms of the queer people's need. And LGBTI health and queer health is mainly described by HIV, just like the rest of the world. And the public health and medical interventions mostly focus on HIV. And so other health needs like lesbian, bisexual women's health need, and mental health for young LGBTQ people, mental health for general population, and transition-related healthcare is very big problem that is like faced by LGBTQ people. And for example, trans people, if one trans person wants like his or her, like their transition, it is really hard for them to access healthcare. It's really hard for them to access hormone therapy. And it's even hard for them to consult with someone who has experience, someone who has, unbiased, or like someone who has like LGBT friendly, like health professionals, etc. And yeah, and also Mongolian society is like hyper masculine and like being feminine, like femininity in men is simply not accepted. And because of this like socialist like propaganda that has been taking control over the state and over the public view for like 7 long decades, it just shaped like people's view on many issues very strongly. And yeah, like that's all I can say for now, I guess. Thanks, guys.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I completely understand with how you have both said that on paper Mongolia looks so like it's so far like in the future with all of this, but obviously hearing what you both have to say, you kind of come to realize that that really isn't the case in the situation at all. Inkma, have you got anything to add on to what Jack said?
Yeah, he pretty much wrapped it up. I kind of want to just emphasize on two communities, our youth and our trans community. Youth, they, they are not financially independent. When they're outed, they just experience all sorts of violence, especially those who are supposed to care for them. And many of our volunteers are youth and young adults, and we also document human rights violations, and we have documented many heinous crimes. And yeah, when it comes to our trans community, especially for trans women, it's tough out there. It's really tough out there. Yeah, but I also kind of want to share inner community struggle.
The Zoom housekeeping. You'll very likely have heard this a lot before, so
Okay, that's yeah. Not currently. It's been there, but there are a few issues that we are trying to address. That, however, we just don't know how yet. One of them is violence within the communities, particularly within the trans women community. There is a lot of violence going on. And then also within the gay, bisexual men community, there is a lot of intimidation, recording and reporting them, demanding money for their photos. This is happening within our community, and we are constantly searching for ways to handle or even have to even approach these issues. This has been a very big challenge for us. During COVID, many of our young people and seniors struggled because, we don't have the right to have a family here. So many seniors are still single, and a lot of people were broke during COVID. Young people, homeless, experienced homelessness. Young people who left home, who came to the city, no money, no security, no relatives. So these are most recent struggles we have been experiencing in our community. Before COVID-19 happened, there were 11 LGBTQI bars and pubs in Ulaanbaatar city, and now we only have just few left. Many of them closed down. One of the oldest queer bar in Ulaanbaatar was forced to close because they refused to. They were always targeted by the police, and they were refused to renew their registration. So it's gone underground now, and it's even underground, they are being targeted, and it's really tough. So our space is very closed. And we just recently had a presidential election, and it's kind of turning dark because this new president has a military background. He's kind of like a big fan of Putin. So since his new administration entered, we can evidently see law enforcement becoming more violent. They are using excessive force on peaceful assembly just recently happened. And, during Equality and Pride Days, when we organize our Pride March, it's always a hassle. And we are stuck with this president for the next 6 years. So it's very alarming at the moment.
Thank you so much for this information.
Just to add, like young people and mental health issues. So mental health is very concerning problem in Mongolia within the young population. So Mongolia is like suicide is the second leading cause of like young people parallel to world statistics in Mongolia. And Mongolia was the second highest in Asia Pacific in terms of like suicide rates for many years. Now it's like fourth or fifth. We still like top 5 country in the region when it comes to suicide rate. So like, and unfortunately, like, the evidence is not there. Like, we believe that like LGBTQ youth, especially in the youth, like statistic, like LGBTQ youth or like sexual and gender diversity could be one of the cause that is, like contributing to this data, but like we don't have any like sufficient evidence to state that, because like generally like this academic study is not very well established in Mongolia, and young people are very under-researched, and queer like data is not there. We don't have any official data. We don't have any research that is very good. Only like national research was conducted by the center with the help of National Human Rights Commission in 2011, if I remember correctly. But that data is not enough, and that data is so old right now. And study and research hasn't been done in Mongolia that focus on LGBT people. So everything we say, everything we do, everything like the center and activists do in Mongolia is based on experience, lived experience and cases. Unfortunately, we don't have any strong data and evidence that can support and push everything we are stating. That is like, that makes our like job like unreliable sometimes on many level. And yeah, like, and like especially as a like health like guy in health problem, like working in a health problem, mental health is very concerning problem in Mongolia, and suicide is just like so hitting the ring for so long, especially within the young population. But then unfortunately, again, we don't have any evidence if that's the case within the like queer young people as well.
Thank you so much for that information. Yeah, I can imagine obviously how much of a concern it must be within Mongolia with the mental health awareness, especially with such a high suicide rate. And obviously, as Inkma said, there's not very many bars or clubs or anywhere that queer people in Mongolia can, like in that capital city, can go and socialize, which will put a massive strain on people's mental health. Thank you so much for that. So moving on to our next question, and I feel you both can relate to this from different, going and studying, obviously Inkma in the United States and Jack being in Australia. How do you feel that this compares to the rest of the world in terms of the human rights of the LGBTQ community?
Well, I mean, I can't compare Mongolia to San Francisco. It's just, I guess within the regime, we're not, we're not struggling. It's hard to like compare and contrast. Within our regime, compared to many countries, we're decent, in certain areas. For example, in Thailand, there is no gender marker law. However, queer people's experienced life is much better than Mongolia. So like paper versus like the real life situation. I really miss what I miss the most. I mean, it, to be safe, you know, having that feeling of safe and secure, walking down the street, not being afraid of who's gonna, you know, punch me or whatever. Because I was attacked, and yeah, so I don't know. Take it away, Jack, because this is a very hard question.
So I lived in Mongolia for my entire life. I was born and raised there, and I went to Melbourne like exactly 2 years ago. So like I'm finishing my journey of like study here, going back. So a lot to prepare myself. So like Ingmar said, like I felt very safe and secure here. I've never felt this safe ever in my entire life. So Melbourne, Australia, Melbourne is one of the coolest city in the world. Very gay friendly. I can be just like a gay man and be proud, you know, but like back home, yeah, it's really hard to compare. It's just safety and security is not there. You can't be gay, you can't be queer, you can't be trans, and it's hard. And also we are comparatively better on the paper on many level within the region, like, you know, within the like continental, we are much better than like Middle Eastern Africa and some part of like Southeast Asia. And on the paper, we're even like so much better. But reality is really different. I never felt this safe in Mongolia. It's really like, as an out activist and very flamboyant, feminine gay man, like every day on the street is like harassment. Like people are not gonna just pass me, they're just gonna say something. Every morning starts with like people saying something on the street. Uh, and yeah, like I felt really similar to Inkmine. I just like don't want to say like it's really bad, but it like at the same time it's really bad, and we're doing like comparatively better than some countries, but like we're doing worse than many parts of the world. And yeah, safety and security is really important. That's how I felt for the last 2 years living in like Melbourne. Like it's not something we had back home, and I'm jealous about it, you know. Like young people and everyone is growing up being scared and like not even being able to express themselves. But in here, it's just, in many parts of the world, it's just simple part of life. And now, like, you know, like people are just so tired of this labels, and like the progressive part of the world are moving towards different direction, but we're still struggling on the fundamental level, trying to let people understand what is gay and what is like trans, what is the difference between that. We can't talk about this like, you know, like different pansexuality and different like, you know, fluidity, and we can't talk about like that different level of like no label and stuff. It's just really hard, and that gap between this like understanding of this context is just way too far. And sometimes like felt like living in two different like generations, you know. Like seems like Mongolia is like already stuck in 90s and 80s of those like Western society, like Australia and Melbourne living in 2020, but we are living like 80s and like beginning of 90s. It's just really hard to explain to some extent.
Thank you so much for trying to explain it. I obviously understand it must be a very difficult thing to try and compare everything. I think that probably leads quite well into our next question of, in what would you like to see done both in Mongolia and globally for the lives of the LGBT community?
Okay. I think just like three things. Practice intersectionality, diversity, and inclusion. You know, I think when we accurately identify a social issue, only then we can find the solution. So, taking an intersectional approach to social illness and, embracing diversity, and then learning to practice inclusion, that's, I think, is that will improve not only LGBTQI people, but anybody who is outside of binary gender structure and heteronormativity, heterosexism. And yeah, that's it for me.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm also like echoing intersectionality is the future. The future is intersectional, you know. So the Western world is struggling on many issues, even though like this like developing world is so progressive in terms of many issues, they're still like facing a lot of challenges. So one of them is like intersectionality. Now, like currently, like recent years, intersectionality is addressed very strongly in many fields, especially in academics, you know. So social determinants of health and social issues it's not just one issues, like people are just a combine of many different issues, many different identities, so we have to consider that. And in Western, like especially in terms of like specifically queer rights movement is facing in Western world, like facing problems in charge of intersectionality. So like global as sustainable development goal motto, leave no one behind. So I think right now in the movement, like there are like a lot of gaps between sub communities and people of color, the racism, misogyny, and like transphobia is very strong, like starting to get addressed in like Western world, and people of color, especially the intersectionality, the people of color and trans identity is combined, makes people's life much harder. Like in the States, like trans people of color's rights have been just ignored and excluded for many years. Now, finally, they're starting to address it. In Melbourne as well, racism is a big problem against like Asian and like indigenous community. So not just like queer issues, like other identity issues, specifically racial like equality movement should be addressed in the global movement more strongly and accurately. And to me, like queer rights movement progressed a lot for last couple of decades, since like it was Netherlands, the first country that actually legalized marriage equality in 2001, if I remember. Since then, it's almost like less than 30 countries, like 29 or 30 countries legalized marriage equality already. And a lot of like bills and like Equal Rights Act and anti-discrimination legislation have been applied and adopted in many countries. But again, like queer rights movement progressed in very short decades, but racial movement is still struggling for centuries. Why is that? Again, like queer rights movement was mostly a white movement in Western societies. That is why it progressed like comparatively better, in my opinion. But like now, finally, like this racial movement and queer rights movement are starting to combine and fighting for those who are like marginalized within the marginalized community, in my opinion. And in Mongolia's case, we are very homogeneous society in terms of race. We are extremely homogeneous. That is why it is really, again, hard for many of us to understand about this racial movements, because we've never experienced that. It is hard for us to empathize that. But we have ethnic minorities, ethnic like human rights issues, a big problem in Mongolia, and nationalism, this like fear of like, like losing the country land to the neighbor of China is created like big like national rhetoric among Mongolia. And yeah, like we are like heading towards this intersectional approach as well, but still it's going to be a tough challenge for us to be.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We're running a little bit low on time, and this is a question that caught my eye in the chat, leading on from Ikma saying earlier about how there's a lot of homelessness and everything to do with the LGBTQI community in Mongolia and in the city. So this is just a question from the chat, and it is, to what extent is poverty an issue for the LGBTQI plus people in Mongolia?
As I was stated, we don't have any sufficient data to answer their questions, and we have very poverty is definitely poverty and queer identities has strong connection for sure. And I think we have very small qualitative research had been done many years ago about the poverty and LGBTQ discrimination. So that small research supports that LGBT discrimination contributes to poverty among queer community, but we don't have to what extent we're not able to provide that accurate information right now, because research and academic study hasn't been done yet. And even though state-sponsored research and studies and initiatives never included the LGBT community historically, the queer community is historically excluded from every initiative, every research, every public health and public interventions since forever. And unfortunately, because of that, we're not able to provide any sufficient evidence and number of statistics.
Thank you, Jack. And Ikma, do you have anything to add to that, or?
No, he nailed it.
Perfect. Well, we'll squeeze in one last question, obviously, before the end, and that is, how do you think that the global community can support your goals?
It's very big. Yeah, I think very similar to my earlier answer, each individual, or whatever you do, whatever you practice in life, take intersectional approach, embrace diversity, and practice inclusion. And yeah, I think that's the key. Yeah, I can't say do this. I mean, I can say a lot of things. I can say a lot of things to governments or business owners or an individual or homophobics or allies. But yeah, most important thing is practicing these three things.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that answer. And Jack, do you have anything to add to that?
I think all I can say is fight for queer rights in your country. So that's the biggest contribution that you can anyone can do to global movement. If for example Australia or England or any other kind of states, situation improved, that it has impacts globally, because developing worlds has a lot of influential power throughout the world. There's third world countries have looking up, and queer rights activists from East Asia and Middle Eastern actually take example of those countries to improve the situation. And yeah, so my what I can say is fight for the queer rights in your own country. So that is technically contributing to the global movement.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And just as a quick follow-up, just before we run out of time, earlier when we were talking about the history, and Jack, you were saying about how most of it is just oral history, there was a question put in the chat about, you talked about the oral history that was passed down to the people. Has anyone tried to document and write down any queer history of Mongolia that you know
of? These days we have few, yes, absolutely. Me saying there's a lack of evidence, that doesn't mean we don't have any. So recently a lot of young people initiating to archive queer history, and also we have several very good papers that include homosexuality and gender diversity written in academic literature, which I just found out during the process of my master's. And I was like, oh, I couldn't say like there's no evidence or whatever. Like some part, like to some extent, it is like, you know, like exposed to the Western literature, and but not specifically focusing on gay and queer or lesbian queer community. So like, for example, like talking about one paper is talking about like Mongolian sexuality. So it was like mostly describing how people view sexuality before, during, and post like socialist and socialist regime. So part of the section, one section dedicated to homosexuality, for example. So that kind of like things would like including written like a little bit. And in terms of oral history, so LGBT Center is doing an amazing job, and we have this youth leadership program since 2013, and I was like one of the first participants of that program before I started like working for LGBT Center. So I was one of the youth leaders of the center and had a chance to work for the center as a full-time staff. And so it's one of the like long lasting program that LGBT Center is like implementing for years. And every year, as part of the youth leadership program, at the end of the program, young people like conduct their own small scale projects. So I've remembered like some of the participants did oral history and archived some of the queer history. So like if you can just Google like contact to the center, you can easily access to those, I guess. And also in academic field, if you can use some like keywords in Mongolian LGBTQ, you can see at least 2 or 3 papers that can like give you a brief introduction or summary about like Mongolian queer issues in their field.
Brilliant.
And yeah, and also sorry,
No,
and
it's
also I'm like probably publishing my paper, so it's gonna be published on one of the journal at the end of like this year, I guess. I'm applying my paper like end of July, so it takes some time. So probably it's gonna be published by the end of the year. So I'm super happy about that. So another like, you know, evidence, another like academic like paper that can support like my movement, our history. Looking forward to that. Thank you.
That's amazing, and that sounds so great that you're publishing your paper to get obviously more information out there and everything. So just to wrap up everything, obviously thank you so much to our 2 guests who have come on. There's links being put in the chat to find out more information about the LGBT Centre, where you can donate, you can find out more information, as well as more information about ReportOUT. I've also popped in the chat, there is a feedback form link if everybody could please give some feedback on the event and how they found it. Hopefully we will be able to have another event like this. We had so many more questions for you guys, and thank you so much for all the information that you provided. Brilliant.
Thank you everyone for being here, and yeah.
I can see there's like so much love being left in the chat from all over the world for you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thank you so much for organizing this event. It was like amazing to talk about our experience to the global like audience. So we don't do that very often. Unfortunately, Mongolia is a very small country, so not so many people are interested in Mongolia. And even like geographically, we are very interesting. Sometimes we just cut from the East Asia, sometimes we cut from, you know, sometimes like there is no region that include us, and like we just like very easily excluded from many things. And yeah, it's, and also the queer issues just not very interesting in Mongolia. So it was really nice for Inkma and me to talk about our experience and our like work. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. I can speak from clearly by the chat that everyone has really appreciated hearing all the information that you have. And I know myself, I've really like, this has been extremely informative. The recording will go on our YouTube channel for anyone that wants to come back and reference to what information you've said. And like I said, there's a link to the LGBT Centre and where you can find out more information. But thank you so much, guys.
Have a good one, everyone. Bye.
See you later. Thank you.
Thank you. Has the recording stopped?